Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil as they follow the road laid out by the American pageant, occasionally taking unexpected turns to explore the side paths history often hides.
Welcome. We're diving into a really critical period in American history today, those intense 15 months between April 1775 and July 1776.
That's right. It's a time when you see this incredible shift. Colonists went from demanding their rights as Englishmen to declaring complete independence.
And it wasn't a straight line, was it? It was contested, complex.
Absolutely. Not inevitable at all. Many twists and turns. Our focus today is really on the key events, the evolving ideas, and the deep divisions that ultimately led to the birth of a new nation.
Okay, let's start where the fighting really began. Lexington and Concord. What set that off and why was it so important?
Well, on April 19th, 1775, British troops marched out from Boston. Their orders were essentially to seize colonial arms stored in Concord and possibly arrest key patriot figures like Samuel Adams and John Hancock.
But it didn't quite go to plan.
Not at all. The famous shot heard round the world, though we don't know for sure who fired first, signaled the start of open warfare. Militarily, the British destroyed some supplies, but politically, it was a disaster for them.
How so?
It acted as a powerful catalyst. It convinced many colonists, who might have been on the fence, that armed resistance was necessary. It showed the colonial militia were actually prepared to stand up to British regulars.
And the British underestimated that resolve.
Hugely, it seems. The swift response was remarkable. Thousands of militiamen from all over New England converged on Boston almost immediately, trapping the British troops there.
Which sets the stage for the Siege of Boston. And the Second Continental Congress is meeting around this time too, right?
Exactly. As something like 20,000 colonial militia surrounded Boston, the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia May 10th, 1775. They had a massive job ahead of them.
Like what? Managing a war that hadn't even been fully declared.
Precisely. They had to coordinate this burgeoning war effort while grappling with deep internal disagreements about what the actual goal was. Was it reconciliation? Was it something more?
So what were their first big moves?
Yeah. One key step was formally adopting those New England forces outside Boston as the Continental Army. And then, crucially, they appointed George Washington of Virginia as commander-in-chief.
Why Washington? Was that a political choice?
Very much so. Washington was a respected Virginian from the largest colony. Choosing him helped, bind the southern colonies to what many initially saw as a New England conflict. It was about unity.
But not everyone in Congress was ready for war.
Definitely not. There was still a strong, let's call it a conservative element, people hoping desperately for reconciliation. So Congress was in this odd position, preparing for war, organizing an army, but still officially seeking peace.
Then came a major escalation, the Battle of Bunker Hill. Though it wasn't actually on Bunker Hill mostly.
That's right, mostly fought on Breed's Hill nearby, on June 17th, 1775. Colonial troops had rapidly built fortifications overlooking Boston. The British, under General Howe, decided they had to clear them out.
And they attacked directly.
They did. Frontal assaults. The colonists famously ordered, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes," partly because they were low on ammunition, repelled 2 major attacks.
But the British eventually took the hill.
Yes. The third assault succeeded largely because the colonists ran out of ammunition and had to retreat. But the cost for the British was staggering. Over 1,000 casualties, a huge number of officers lost. It was their highest casualty count for any single battle in the entire war.
A tactical win, but a strategic shock for the British.
Absolutely. It was a very sobering experience. It shattered any illusions about the colonists just folding. It forced a major rethink of colonial military capability and led to more cautious British planning later on.
And it also pushed them towards hiring mercenaries.
Yes. The heavy losses underscored their need for more manpower, which contributed to the decision to hire Hessian troops from German states. A very controversial move.
And for the colonists, even though they lost the ground, it was a boost.
A huge psychological victory. It showed they could stand up to British regulars, inflict heavy damage. It boosted morale, rallied support, and demonstrated their determination despite the tactical loss.
But it wasn't all positive. It showed some weaknesses, too.
Oh, certainly. The battle exposed significant problems with colonial command, organization, logistics. There were issues of units not obeying orders, supplies not getting where they needed to be. Things were still pretty chaotic.
So looking at these early fights, Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill, it seems like things escalated reactively. rather than some grand plan for independence from the start.
That's a really important point. Initially, it wasn't a unified drive for independence, nor was it a deliberate British strategy of conquest. British actions were often intended as shows of force, attempts to disarm. Colonial responses were initially defensive.
But the bloodshed changed everything.
Fundamentally, these battles became potent political symbols. Lexington and Concord were framed as British aggression. Bunker Hill became a symbol of American courage, even in defeat, and British vulnerability.
Does this challenge the idea of reluctant revolutionaries? New England seemed pretty ready to fight.
It does complicate it. While Congress and many moderates were genuinely reluctant, the rapid mobilization in New England suggests the significant portion of the population there was perhaps less hesitant. You have this contradictory situation: colonists fighting British soldiers while still claiming loyalty to the king.
Right. So let's talk about those efforts to reconcile, even as the fighting raged. The Second Continental Congress was trying to walk a tightrope.
A very fine line. Through the summer of 1775 and into early 76, Congress was acting like a de facto government, organizing the army, trying to find supplies but also pursuing peace. Many delegates genuinely believed they could appeal directly to King George III.
They thought he was separate from Parliament's actions.
Yes, there was this persistent belief that the king was potentially sympathetic, that Parliament was the real problem. So you get this dual strategy: military prep on one hand, diplomatic outreach on the other. Figures like John Dickinson were key here, pushing for asserting rights within the empire.
And the main diplomatic effort was the Olive Branch Petition.
That was the big one, yes. Adopted July 5th, 1775, mostly written by Dickinson, it was a final major attempt by moderates to head off all-out war.
What did it actually say?
It affirmed loyalty to the king, expressed tender regard for Britain, and basically pleaded with George III to step in, repeal the coercive acts, and restore harmony. The language was very deferential, aiming to restore rights within the empire, not break from it.
But wasn't Congress sending mixed signals? Didn't they approve something much tougher around the same time?
They did, and that's crucial. Almost simultaneously, on July 6th, Congress adopted the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. Co-authored by Jefferson and Dickinson, it struck a much more defiant tone, stating their determination to defend their liberties by force if needed.
So one document pleads for peace, the other says we'll fight.
Exactly. And that, plus intercepted letters from radicals like John Adams, basically saying the olive branch was pointless and war was coming anyway, made the British highly skeptical of its sincerity.
How did the king react when the Olive Branch Petition reached London?
He refused to even receive it formally. Instead, on August 23, 1775, he issued the Proclamation of Rebellion. It declared the colonies in open revolt and branded the leaders as traitors.
Wow. So much for the king being a potential mediator.
Absolutely. This shattered that illusion for many. News of Bunker Hill had also reached London by then, hardening the king's resolve. The path to reconciliation seemed well and truly closed from the British perspective, and they started making arrangements to hire those Hessian mercenaries.
A real turning point, then. The king's rejection and the hiring of Hessians must have pushed many colonists towards independence.
Without a doubt, the rejection itself was huge, and hiring foreign troops, Hessians felt like the king was treating them not as subjects to be reconciled, but as foreign enemies to be crushed. It fueled the arguments for separation immensely.
And then adding fuel to the fire, particularly in the South, was Lord Dunmore's proclamation in Virginia.
Yes, in November 1775, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, declared martial law and offered freedom to any enslaved person or indentured servant belonging to a patriot master who was willing to fight for the British.
A strategic move, but incredibly inflammatory.
Extremely. It was aimed at disrupting the patriot cause and bolstering British forces, but it absolutely terrified Virginia's powerful slave-holding elite.
Why? Fear of losing labor or something more?
Both, but especially the fear of armed slave insurrection. It tapped into their deepest anxieties about social upheaval and losing control. Seeing enslaved men actually fleeing to British lines and forming units like Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian regiment made the threat feel very real.
So this pushed hesitant Southern leaders towards independence.
Significantly. It convinced many that allegiance to a crown willing to essentially turn their enslaved population against them was impossible. While a military tactic, its biggest impact was political. It alienated Southern moderates and solidified support for independence as a way to protect their entire economic and social system, their racial hierarchy.
It seems like by the end of 1775, the hope for reconciliation was fading fast. The king wasn't listening, and actions like Dunmore's proclamation were driving wedges.
Precisely. The failure of reconciliation was complex. The colonists' shifting view of the king, Congress's own mixed signals, and British actions that kept backfiring, pushing more people away. By early 1776, the stage was set for a much more radical conversation.
And into that charged atmosphere steps Thomas Paine with Common Sense. It's hard to overstate its impact, right?
Almost impossible. Published in January 1776, Common Sense just electrified the colonies. Paine didn't just criticize policies, he attacked the entire concept of monarchy and hereditary rule in really clear, powerful language anyone could understand.
He didn't mince words about King George either.
Not at all. Famously called him the royal brute of England. He argued that reconciliation was a fallacious dream, that connection to Britain brought only disadvantages, dragging America into European wars, restricting its trade. He basically said, show me one good reason to stay connected.
And his solution was
Immediate independence, and not just independence, but a Republican government with power flowing from the people. He painted this vision of America having a unique chance to begin the world over again, to be an asylum for mankind.
And people read it.
In massive numbers. Estimates suggest maybe 500,000 copies sold, which is incredible for the time. It was read aloud everywhere. Taverns, homes, public meetings. It reached across social classes and decisively shifted public opinion towards independence, putting huge pressure on Congress.
He really knew how to connect Enlightenment ideas with common language.
That was his genius. He took these philosophical ideas about rights and government and made them feel urgent, logical, and necessary for the average person.
And these Enlightenment ideas were already circulating among the colonial leadership.
Oh, absolutely. Thinkers like John Locke, his ideas about natural rights, life, liberty, property, or pursuit of happiness, the social contract, the right of revolution, these were foundational. Leaders like Jefferson, Adams, Franklin were steeped in this stuff.
So the argument was that legitimate government needs the consent of the governed.
Exactly. And since the colonies had no representation in Parliament, Parliament taxing and ruling them was illegitimate. It lacked their consent. And when a government starts destroying those natural rights, Locke argued, the people have the right to alter or abolish it.
So this philosophical framework turned it from a tax dispute into a fight for fundamental liberties.
Precisely. It framed the conflict as a stand against tyranny, a defense of universal rights. And these ideas spread through pamphlets, speeches, resolutions, making the case for self-determination.
You also mentioned the Great Awakening earlier. How did that religious movement play into this? It seems less direct.
It's more indirect, yeah. The revivals decades earlier emphasized individual spiritual experience, a direct link to God, challenging established church authority.
So it fostered a kind of anti-authoritarian spirit.
In a way, it created a cultural climate more willing to question traditional hierarchies, whether religious or political. The push for religious liberty against established churches arguably fed into the later push for civil liberty against the crown. Plus, the idea of spiritual equality before God had perhaps some democratizing undertones.
And there was also a religious dimension to the patriot cause itself, a sense of destiny.
Very much so for many. They saw their struggle as righteous, divinely favored. Patriot clergy often framed resistance to tyranny as a moral, even a Christian duty. There was this powerful sense that America had a special, providential role to play to be a beacon of liberty. That belief provided a strong spiritual motivation.
Okay, so the ideological case for independence is building strongly by 1776. But you mentioned divisions earlier. It wasn't like everyone suddenly agreed.
Far from it. It's easy to forget, but colonial society was deeply divided. The Revolution was as much a battle for hearts and minds within America as it was against Britain.
What were the rough numbers? How did people split?
The common estimates, and they're just estimates, suggest maybe 30–40% were active patriots, maybe 15–20% were active loyalists, and the largest group, perhaps 40–50%, were initially neutral, undecided, or just trying to stay out of it.
Let's talk about the patriots first. Who were they? What drove them?
Patriots, or Whigs as they were often called, were driven by that mix of ideology, defense of liberties, self-government, natural rights, and reaction to perceived British overreach. They genuinely believed Britain aimed to enslave them, politically speaking. New England was a stronghold. Motivations varied, of course, ideology for some, economic grievances for others, especially merchants hit by trade rules. Groups like the Sons of Liberty were crucial in mobilizing support.
And the Loyalists, or Tories, why did they stick with Britain?
Loyalists opposed independence for many reasons. Some felt rebellion was morally wrong. Others believed grievances could be fixed within the empire. Many feared the chaos independence might bring or stood to lose economically. Some just had strong personal, family, or business ties to Britain.
Did they make their case publicly?
Yes, through pamphlets too, countering patriot arguments. Charles Inglis's The True Interest of America, or James Chalmers' Plain Truth, argued against independence, warning of war and ruin. Loyalists often tended to be, though not always, wealthier, more conservative, often Anglican, sometimes more recent immigrants. They were numerous in places like New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and parts of the South.
And they faced persecution.
Absolutely, from verbal abuse and intimidation to violence, property confiscation, and eventually exile for many. It was often brutal.
And the largest group, the moderates or undecided.
They initially hoped for compromise. People like John Dickinson led this group, focusing on petitions like the Olive Branch, seeking redress within the system. They feared the consequences of a full break, but British hardline policies, the king's rejection, the escalating war, all this gradually pushed many of them towards the patriot side. Often, local events or persuasion decided which way they went.
Economic factors must have played a huge role in these choices, differing by region.
Definitely. In New England, the maritime economy, trade, fishing, shipbuilding made them very sensitive to British regulations. They had fewer direct ties to Britain than some other areas, fueling the Patriot cause.
The middle colonies were more mixed.
Much more diverse economies, farming, trade led to more political division. Wealthy Quaker merchants in Philadelphia might lean loyalist or neutral, fearing disruption, while farmers and artisans might be more patriot. New York City, with its strong commercial links, was a loyalist hub.
And the South, dominated by agriculture and slavery.
Right. Tobacco, rice, indigo, all dependent on enslaved labor. This made Southern planters, the free white population, technically the wealthiest. They had grievances over British trade rules restricting who they could sell to. The desire for direct trade with Europe was a big economic motivator for independence there.
Which brings us back to slavery. Its role seems absolutely central, especially for the South.
It's impossible to understand the Southern move towards independence without it. The paradox was stark colonists demanding liberty while enslaving others. Dr. Johnson's famous quip about the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes highlights that.
So protecting slavery became a key reason for Southern independence.
Increasingly so. The Somerset court case in England raised fears about slavery's long-term security within the empire. Then Dunmore's proclamation offering freedom to escaped slaves who fought for the British, that was seen as an existential threat to their entire social and economic order. It really pushed hesitant Southern elites over the edge, convincing them independence was the only way to guarantee control over their human property.
It paints a picture of a revolution driven by high ideals, but also deeply tangled with self-interest and profound contradictions.
That's exactly right. It was a civil war in many ways, with these internal divisions, economic, regional, and especially over slavery, shaping allegiances, just as much as the conflict with Britain itself.
So by spring 1776, with Common Sense circulating and Dunmore's proclamation alarming the South, the momentum in Congress is really shifting towards independence.
Yes, significantly. Public opinion was moving, the king was clearly intransigent, the war was escalating. Crucially, individual colonies started changing their instructions to their delegates in Congress.
Which colonies led the way?
North Carolina was first, with the Halifax Resolves in April 1776, authorizing a vote for independence. Rhode Island effectively declared its own independence in early May. It was a complex political fight within each colony to get these new instructions passed. Congress couldn't act without a majority mandate.
And Congress itself was taking steps.
Yes. Resolutions on May 10th and 15th, pushed hard by John Adams, urged colonies to form new governments independent of the crown. Adams saw his May 15th preamble, justifying this break, as effectively the declaration itself. But a formal, unified statement was still needed.
Which brings us to Richard Henry Lee's resolution in June.
Correct. On June 7th, 1776, Lee, following instructions from Virginia, introduced his famous resolution that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. It also called for forming foreign alliances and a plan for confederation.
That must have finally forced the issue. What was the debate like?
Intense. Proponents like Adams argued it was essential for getting foreign aid, especially from France, unifying the war effort and establishing legitimacy. Opponents, like John Dickinson again, argued it was too soon.
Dickinson's argument was basically, let's get our ducks in a row first.
Essentially. Secure alliances, create a stable government before declaring independence. He worried they lacked the unity and resources to go it alone just yet. And initially, several colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, South Carolina, and New Jersey, weren't ready or authorized to vote yes. So they postponed the final vote on Lee's resolution to July 1st to allow time for new instructions.
But they knew it was likely coming, so they appointed a committee to draft a declaration.
Exactly. On June 11th, recognizing they'd need a formal document if Lee's resolution passed, Congress appointed the Committee of Five: Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston.
And Jefferson became the main writer.
Yes. He was known for his eloquent writing. Adams later said he persuaded Jefferson, arguing a Virginian should take the lead and that Jefferson wrote better. Jefferson drew on Enlightenment philosophy, George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights, and other documents. He showed his draft to Adams and Franklin, who made some minor edits. The committee presented the draft to Congress on June 28th.
So July 1st, the debate on Lee's resolution resumes. How did the vote finally happen on July 2nd?
Political maneuvering was key. By July 2nd, shifts had occurred. Delaware's delegation got a pro-independence majority. South Carolina changed its mind. 2 Pennsylvania delegates opposed to independence stayed away, so 12 colonies voted yes. New York abstained initially, still awaiting instructions, but they approved it later.
So July 2nd was the actual vote for independence. Adams thought that'd be the big day.
He did. He wrote to Abigail that July 2nd would be celebrated through the ages. But then Congress spent July 2nd, 3rd, and 4th debating and editing Jefferson's declaration. They formally adopted the revised version on July 4th.
And the famous signing wasn't even on July 4th.
Mostly not. The iconic signing of the fancy parchment copy happened primarily on August 2nd. The focus on July 4th really emphasizes the importance of the document itself, the public statement of ideals and reasons, rather than just the vote.
What are the core assertions in that document?
The preamble is incredibly powerful. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, asserting rights to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and the right of the people to abolish a government that destroys those rights, deeply influenced by Locke.
How is all men are created equal understood then?
Primarily, in 1776, it was understood in a collective sense that the American people as a whole were equal to other peoples, like the British, and had the right to self-government. It wasn't initially interpreted as individual equality in the way we might think of it today, especially given the existence of slavery. Then, the bulk of the Declaration is a long list of grievances against King George III, meant to prove he'd violated the social contract and justify the revolution.
One major edit Congress made was removing Jefferson's clause condemning the slave trade. Why?
That was a huge and revealing change. Jefferson had written a really passionate passage blaming the king for forcing the slave trade on the colonies and inciting enslaved people to revolt. He called it a cruel war against human nature itself.
So why take it out?
Primarily pressure from South Carolina and Georgia delegates, whose economies absolutely depended on slavery and who wanted to keep importing slaves. Jefferson also noted some northern delegates were uneasy, as their constituents had profited significantly from the slave trade as shippers.
So unity trumped abolitionist sentiment.
Completely. The need for a united front against Britain overrode the moral contradiction. It exposed the deep compromise at the heart of the revolution. The final declaration only kept a veiled reference to the king inciting domestic insurrections, which could mean slave revolts or Native American attacks. It was a punt, really, deferring a problem that would eventually tear the nation apart.
The declaration wasn't just for domestic consumption, though. It was aimed at the world, too.
Absolutely. It was a vital piece of foreign policy. Declaring themselves free and independent states was crucial for seeking legitimacy and, critically, foreign aid. They desperately needed help, especially from France and Spain.
As Paine argued, you needed to be independent to get formal alliances.
Precisely. It changed the game from an internal rebellion to a war between nations, making it easier for countries like France to intervene openly.
How did other countries react? Britain first.
Officially dismissive. Propaganda countered the complaints. The king condemned the leaders, but some in Parliament, like Drake, knew it was a serious shift. Generally positive reception, especially among Enlightenment thinkers. They saw it as a fight against tyranny. Foreign Minister Vergennes saw it as paving the way for the alliance that came after Saratoga.
And Spain.
More cautious. They worried about the precedent for their own colonies. They provided covert aid but didn't formally recognize the U.S. until later. Still, the declaration was an appeal for their help, too.
It really underscores how this document was doing multiple things at once, justifying the break, stating ideals, seeking allies, all while papering over deep internal cracks.
That's a great summary. It reveals the complex mix of high principle and pragmatic, sometimes deeply compromised, politics involved in founding the nation.
This has been a really insightful look into that incredibly dense and transformative period. Any final thoughts to leave us with?
Well, those 15 months really were a crucible. You see this dramatic shift from subjects seeking rights to rebels declaring a new nation. It wasn't smooth or unified. It was driven by conflict, ideology, political struggle, and deep social divisions.
And the Declaration itself embodies that complexity.
It does. It's a powerful statement of ideals, equality, rights, revolution that continues to inspire. But it was also a product of its time, marked by compromises, especially over slavery, that left a troubled legacy. Understanding this period means grappling with all of that, moving beyond simple, heroic narratives. Perhaps the provocative thought is this. The revolution declared in 1776 set ideals in motion, but the struggle to fully realize those ideals and confront its contradictions is a process that in many ways continues today.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.